She vanished without a word 3 years ago. Tonight she's back with a truth that changes everything. The lighthouse stood tall against the dark sky like a guardian watching over the restless ocean. Rain hammered against the windows while thunder rolled across the water. Inside the small room at the top, David sat reading by lamplight just like he did every evening for the past 3 years. The book lay open in his lap, but his mind wandered to other things. The storm outside reminded him of another night long ago, when everything in his life changed forever. He tried not to think about those days, but storms always brought back memories he'd rather forget. David had chosen this quiet life on purpose. After what happened 3 years ago, he needed space to heal. The lighthouse keeper job was perfect. Just him, the ocean, and ships passing by in the distance. No complications, no heartbreak, no surprises. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The beam from the lighthouse swept across the dark water every few seconds, lighting up the foam and spray. This was his world now, and he'd made peace with it, or so he thought. The old wooden stairs that led to his room always creaked. He knew every sound this lighthouse made after 3 years of living here alone, but tonight, through the noise of the storm, he heard something different. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps climbing those familiar stairs. David froze. Nobody came to the lighthouse at night, especially not during a storm like this. The town was 5 miles away, and the path along the cliff was dangerous even in good weather. His heart started beating faster. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a soft knock. 3 gentle taps that somehow cut through the sound of wind and rain. David stared at the door, unsure if he'd imagined it. Another knock. This time he was sure. He walked slowly to the door, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the handle. Who could possibly be out there on a night like this? A lost hiker? Someone in trouble? He turned the handle and pulled the door open. The woman standing in the doorway was soaked from head to toe. Her long hair stuck to her face and water dripped from her clothes onto the floor. But even in the dim light, even after 3 years, he knew exactly who she was. Lisa, the woman he'd planned to marry. The woman who'd left without saying goodbye. The woman who'd broken his heart so completely that he'd run away to this lighthouse to hide from the world. She looked different now. Older, maybe. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that looked like sadness or regret, or maybe just exhaustion from fighting the storm to get here. Neither of them spoke. What could they say? How do you start a conversation with someone who disappeared from your life without explanation? How do you act normal when your whole world just shifted on its axis? David stepped back, gesturing for her to come inside. She hesitated for a moment, then walked past him into the small room. Her shoes left wet prints on the wooden floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering from the cold. The lighthouse beam swept across the room again, casting moving shadows on the walls. In that moment of light, David could see her more clearly. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were small lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Life had left its mark on her, just like it had on him. Still, nobody spoke. David closed the door and walked to a small kitchen area. His hands moved automatically, filling the kettle with water, getting cups from the shelf, finding tea bags. Simple actions that gave him something to do while his mind tried to process what was happening. Lisa stood by the window, looking out at the storm. Her reflection in the glass looked like a ghost, pale and uncertain. She hugged herself tighter, still shivering. The kettle whistled, breaking the silence. David made 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in the cool air. He walked over to where Lisa stood and held out one of the cups. She took it without looking at him, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. They stood side by side, watching the storm through the window. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, lighting up the chaos outside. Ships in the distance blinked their warning lights, trying to stay safe in the rough waters. David sipped his tea and tried to think of something to say. 3 years of imagined conversations, of things he'd wanted to tell her if he ever saw her again, and now his mind was completely blank. The reality of her being here was so different from anything he'd pictured. Lisa turned to look at him. Her eyes were red, though he couldn't tell if it was from crying or just from the wind and rain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Whatever she'd come here to say, it wasn't easy for her either. The storm seemed to be getting worse. Wind howled around the lighthouse and rain pelted the windows even harder. David realized that even if Lisa wanted to leave, she couldn't. Not in this weather. Not in the dark. She was stuck here until morning, whether either of them wanted it or not. He walked to his closet and pulled out some dry clothes, an old sweater, a pair of sweatpants, thick socks. He held them out to her. This time she looked directly at him. Her eyes searched his face, maybe looking for anger or hurt or any sign of what he was thinking. But David had learned to keep his emotions hidden over the past 3 years. His face gave away nothing. Lisa took the dry clothes and looked around the small room. David pointed to a curtained area in the corner where she could change. She nodded and walked over there, disappearing behind the curtain. David sat down in his chair and tried to steady his breathing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. After 3 years of nothing, no word, no explanation, she shows up in the middle of a storm like something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. He heard the rustle of wet clothes being removed, the soft sound of fabric being pulled on. When Lisa emerged from behind the curtain, she looked more like the woman he remembered. The oversized sweater made her look small and vulnerable. Her hair was still damp, but she'd managed to push it back from her face. She sat down on the small couch across from his chair. The distance between them felt enormous, like a canyon that couldn't be crossed. But she was here. After all this time, after all the pain, she was actually here. The question was why, and David wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The silence in the room felt heavy, like a thick blanket that neither of them could push away. David sat in his chair, holding his cup of tea with both hands, staring at the steam rising from it. Lisa sat on the couch, also looking down at her cup, as if the answers to all their questions might be floating in the warm liquid. Outside, the storm continued its angry dance. The lighthouse beam kept turning, painting the room with moving light and shadow every few seconds. It was like watching time itself move in slow circles, marking each uncomfortable moment that passed between them. David had imagined this moment so many times over the past 3 years. In his mind, he'd been angry, demanding answers. Sometimes he'd pictured himself calm and cold, showing her that he'd moved on completely. Other times he'd imagined falling apart, letting her see how much her leaving had destroyed him. But now that she was actually here, he felt none of those things. Instead, he felt empty, like someone had scooped out his insides and left him hollow. The person sitting across from him looked like Lisa, but everything felt different. Maybe too much time had passed. Maybe some things couldn't be fixed. Lisa shifted on the couch, and the movement made David look up at her. She was studying his face, and when their eyes met, she quickly looked away. It reminded him of how they used to be in the beginning, before they got comfortable with each other. Back when every glance felt important, when every word carried weight. He noticed things about her that were different now. The way she held her shoulders, a little hunched like she was protecting herself from something. The way she kept touching her hair, pushing it behind her ear even though it was already there. Small nervous habits he didn't remember from before. "The lighthouse suits you," she said suddenly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. It was the first time either of them had spoken since she'd arrived. Her words hung in the air, and David wasn't sure how to respond. Did she mean the job suited him? The loneliness? The isolation? "It's quiet," he said finally. Lisa nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. "I can see why you'd want that." There it was. The first hint that she knew why he'd left their old life behind. That she understood she was the reason he'd needed to disappear, to find somewhere far away from all the memories they'd made together. David stood up and walked to the small kitchen area. He needed to move, to do something with his hands. He opened the refrigerator and looked inside, though he wasn't really seeing anything. Just needed the motion, the normalcy of doing regular things. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his back still turned to her. "No, thank you." He closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. From here he could see her profile as she stared out the window at the storm. She looked tired, like someone who'd been traveling for a long time and still hadn't reached where they were going. "How did you find me?" The question came out before he could stop it. Lisa turned to look at him. "It took me a while. You didn't exactly leave a trail, that was true. When David had left their hometown, he'd done it quietly. No forwarding address, no social media updates, no keeping in touch with mutual friends. He'd wanted to disappear completely, and he'd done a good job of it. Your brother," Lisa continued. "I ran into him at the grocery store about 6 months ago. He mentioned you were working at a lighthouse somewhere on the coast. It took me time to figure out which one. David's jaw tightened. He'd asked his brother not to tell anyone where he was. But Alex had always been soft-hearted, especially when it came to Lisa. Even after everything that happened, his brother had liked her. "Why now?" David asked. "It's been 3 years, Lisa. 3 years of nothing." She flinched at the sharpness in his voice, but she didn't look away. I know it's been a long time. You just disappeared. One day we were planning a wedding, and the next day you were gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye, nothing." The words came out harder than he'd intended, but he couldn't stop them now. 3 years of buried anger was starting to surface, like something that had been trapped underwater, finally breaking free. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I was scared. Scared of what? Of marrying me? Of being happy, of what? Scared of everything." Her voice broke slightly. "Scared of not being good enough for you. Scared of disappointing your family. Scared of messing up something so important." David stared at her. This wasn't what he'd expected to hear. In all his imagined conversations, he'd never considered that she'd left because she was afraid. "My parents never thought I was right for you," Lisa continued. "They kept telling me I should let you find someone better. Someone from a good family. Someone educated. Someone who could fit into your world properly. That's ridiculous. I never cared about any of that. I know you didn't, but I did. Every time we went to family dinners, every time I met your friends, I felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. Like eventually, you'd figure out I wasn't good enough and leave." The lighthouse beam swept across the room again. And in that moment of light, David could see the pain in her eyes. Real pain that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "So you left first," he said quietly. "So I left first." She nodded. "I thought it would hurt less if I was the one who ended it. I thought you'd be angry for a while, then realize you were better off without me." David set his cup down on the counter with a sharp clink. "Better off? Lisa, I spent 6 months thinking something terrible had happened to you. I called hospitals, police stations, everyone we knew. I thought you might be dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over slightly, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought you'd just move on." "Move on?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I haven't had a real conversation with another person in 3 years. I live alone in a lighthouse because I can't handle being around people anymore. Does that sound like moving on to you?" Tears were flowing down her cheeks now, but she didn't try to wipe them away. "I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry, David. I made a terrible mistake." The storm outside seemed to be getting stronger, as if it was feeding off the emotions in the room. Wind rattled the windows and rain pelted the glass so hard it sounded like someone throwing pebbles. David walked back to his chair and sat down. He felt exhausted suddenly, like he'd been holding up something heavy for too long and finally let it drop. "Why are you here, Lisa?"
"After all this time, why now?"
She looked at him with red, swollen eyes. "Because I realized I was wrong about everything. Because I spent 3 years trying to convince myself I did the right thing, and I can't do it anymore. Because I love you, and I never stopped loving you, and I was too much of a coward to admit it." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they could cross. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 3 long years. David stared at Lisa, trying to process what she'd just said. Love. She said she loved him, still loved him, had never stopped loving him. But love wasn't always enough, was it? If it had been, she never would have left in the first place. The storm outside was getting worse by the hour. David could hear the wind howling around the lighthouse like a wild animal trying to get inside. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the chaos. The waves were enormous now, crashing against the rocks with such force that spray reached almost to the lighthouse windows. "I need to check the light," he said, not looking at her. Ships depend on it, especially in weather like this. It was an excuse, and they both knew it. The lighthouse was automated now, had been for years. But David needed to move, needed to do something other than sit in that room with her words echoing in his head. He headed for the spiral staircase that led to the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse. His footsteps echoed in the narrow space, a steady rhythm that helped calm his racing thoughts. Behind him, he heard Lisa following. The lamp room was small and circular, with windows all around that offered a 360-degree view of the ocean. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, especially during a storm, it felt like being inside the eye of a hurricane. David checked the controls even though he knew everything was working perfectly. The huge lens rotated smoothly, sending its beam across the dark water. In the distance, he could see the lights of two ships, both struggling against the waves. Lisa climbed the last few steps and entered the lamp room. She was breathing hard from the climb and her cheeks were flushed. She looked around at the equipment at the windows showing nothing but darkness and rain. "It's incredible up here," she said softly. David nodded but didn't respond. He was focused on one of the ships, watching its lights bob up and down as it fought the waves. It looked like it was having trouble, moving slower than it should be. "Are they okay?" Lisa asked, following his gaze. "I think so. Cargo ship. Probably heading to the port about 20 miles north. Storm like this, they just have to ride it out." They stood side by side, watching the distant lights. The lighthouse beam swept over them every 30 seconds. A brief moment of brilliant light followed by darkness. It was hypnotic in a way. The steady rhythm of light and dark, light and dark. "David," Lisa said quietly, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know what I did was unforgivable. Don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't start making speeches about forgiveness. You don't get to decide what's forgivable." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're right. I'm sorry." The lighthouse beam swept over them again. In that moment of brightness, David glanced at her face. She looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. The confident woman he'd fallen in love with seemed to have been replaced by someone who'd been broken and put back together with cracks still showing. "I tried to find you," she said suddenly. "Not right away. I was too proud, too stubborn. But after about a year, when I realized what I'd really done, I tried. Your brother wouldn't tell me where you were. Your friends wouldn't talk to me. Everyone thought I was poison. They were protecting me, I know, and they were right to do it. But it drove me crazy not knowing if you were okay. I used to drive by your old apartment hoping I'd see your car. I checked social media constantly looking for any sign of you. Nothing." David kept his eyes on the ocean. One of the ships had changed course, moving away from the worst of the storm. "Smart captain." "There were nights," Lisa continued, "when I'd pick up my phone to call you. I'd dial your number and then hang up before it could ring. I must have done that 100 times. My number's been disconnected for 2 years," David said flatly. "I know. I found that out eventually." They fell into silence again. The storm was reaching its peak now, the wind so strong that the lighthouse actually swayed slightly. David had been through storms like this before, and the lighthouse was built to handle much worse, but he could feel Lisa tense beside him. "Is this normal?" she asked. "For a lighthouse?" "Yeah. We're built to take whatever the ocean throws at us." The words came out before he realized how they might sound. "We're built to take whatever the ocean throws at us." Like maybe he was talking about more than just the building. Lisa turned to look at him directly. "David, I didn't come here to ask you to take me back." That surprised him. "Then why did you come?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. The lighthouse beam swept over them 3 times before she spoke again. "I came to tell you the truth. All of it. I came to explain why I really left, not just the scared excuses I gave you downstairs. I came to tell you what happened after and how I changed, and why I finally realized I had to find you." David's hands gripped the window frame. "I'm not sure I want to hear it, I know. But I think you need to, and I know I need to say it." Another sweep of light and darkness. The ship they'd been watching had managed to get farther from shore, moving into safer waters. Its lights were fainter now, but steadier. "After I left," Lisa began, "I went to stay with my cousin in Chicago. I told everyone I was starting fresh, making a new life. I got a job at a marketing firm, found a nice apartment, started dating other people." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. "I thought I was doing great. I thought I'd made the right choice. I kept telling myself how much better my life was without all the pressure, without feeling like I had to be someone I wasn't. But I was miserable. Completely, utterly miserable. The job was boring, the apartment was empty, the guys I dated were—" She shrugged. "They weren't you." The lighthouse beam illuminated her face again, and David could see that she was crying. Not the dramatic tears from downstairs, but quiet ones that just slipped down her cheeks without her seeming to notice. "About 6 months ago, I ended up in the hospital. Nothing serious," she added quickly, seeing his alarmed expression. "I'd been having panic attacks, not sleeping, not eating properly. My body just gave out." David turned to face her fully for the first time since they'd climbed to the lamp room. Lisa. While I was lying in that hospital bed looking up at those awful fluorescent lights, I had what I guess you'd call a moment of clarity. I realized I'd been running from everything that mattered to me. Not just you, but the person I was when I was with you. The person I actually liked being. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I realized that all those fears about not being good enough, about disappointing people, about not fitting in, they were just excuses. I was so terrified of failing that I chose to fail on purpose, just so I could control when and how it happened. The wind rattled the windows, and both of them instinctively stepped closer together. The storm was directly overhead now, lightning flashing every few seconds, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the entire lighthouse. I spent the next few months in therapy, trying to figure out who I really was underneath all that fear, and what I found was someone who had made the biggest mistake of her life 3 years ago. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with tears and determination. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me, David. I came to ask you to let me try to earn it. The words hung between them like a challenge thrown down in the middle of a battlefield. Earn it. She wanted to earn his forgiveness. David stared at her, trying to understand what that even meant after everything that had happened. Lightning flashed outside, so close that the thunder came immediately after, a sound so loud it seemed to come from inside their chests. Lisa jumped slightly, her hand reaching out instinctively toward David before she caught herself and pulled it back. That small movement, that instinct to reach for him when she was scared, hit him harder than all her words combined. Some things, it seemed, never changed. Even after 3 years, even after all the hurt, her body still remembered what her mind had tried to forget. What does that mean? David asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Earning forgiveness? Lisa looked out at the chaos beyond the windows. The ocean was invisible now except when lightning lit it up, showing massive waves that looked like moving mountains. She seemed to be gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself. It means I want to show you, not just tell you, that I've changed. It means I want to prove that I'm not the same person who ran away 3 years ago. She turned back to face him, and David could see something different in her eyes, a steadiness that hadn't been there before, even back when they were together. Back then, she'd always seemed a little uncertain, always looking to him or others for approval. This was different. I spent 3 years learning how to be alone, she continued. Really alone, not just physically, but emotionally. I had to figure out who I was when nobody else was watching, when nobody else's opinion mattered. David found himself studying her face in the intermittent light from the lighthouse beam. She did look different. Not just older, but more solid somehow. Like she'd found her footing on ground that used to shift beneath her feet. And who are you? He asked. A small smile crossed her face, the first real smile he'd seen since she arrived. I'm someone who drives 5 hours through a storm to find the person she loves. I'm someone who finally knows what she wants and isn't afraid to fight for it. Another flash of lightning illuminated the lamp room, and in that moment of brightness, David saw something that made his breath catch. Lisa was slowly, deliberately removing her sweater. What are you doing? He asked, his voice strange and tight. She pulled the sweater over her head and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, she wore a simple white shirt. Her movements were calm, purposeful, nothing hurried or desperate about them. I came for you, she said quietly, her hands moving to the buttons of her shirt. Only you. I came to show you that I have nothing left to hide. David stepped backward, his back hitting the window. Lisa, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Her fingers worked steadily at the buttons. For 3 years, I've been wearing masks, pretending to be someone else, hiding behind fear and excuses. I can't do that anymore. Not with you. The lighthouse beam swept over them again, and David could see that her hands were shaking slightly, but her face was determined. This wasn't about romance or seduction. This was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with truth. This is who I am, she said as she let the shirt slide off her shoulders. This is what I look like without armor, without protection, without anything to hide behind. She stood there in the rotating light of the lighthouse, vulnerable in a way that went far beyond physical exposure. David could see the small scar on her shoulder from when she'd fallen off her bike as a child. The freckles across her collarbone that only appeared in summer. The way she held herself now with a confidence that was new but felt absolutely real. I'm not the same person who left you, she whispered. I'm not the scared girl who thought she wasn't good enough. I'm not someone who runs away anymore. David's throat felt tight. He'd imagined this moment so many times over the years, but never like this. In his dreams, if she ever came back, it had been dramatic and desperate. This was something else. This was brave in a way that made his chest ache. "Lisa," he started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I know this doesn't fix anything," she said. "I know standing here like this doesn't erase 3 years of pain. But I needed you to see that I'm done hiding. I'm done being afraid. I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me." The storm was directly overhead now, the wind so strong that it whistled through every crack in the lighthouse. But inside the lamp room, everything felt strangely calm, like they were in the eye of something much bigger than the weather. "I see you," David said finally, his voice rough with emotion. And he did see her, not just physically, though that was part of it. He saw the courage it had taken to drive here through the storm. He saw the strength it had taken to face him after 3 years of silence. He saw the way she was choosing to be vulnerable instead of defensive, honest instead of careful. "This is how much you mean to me," Lisa continued, her voice steady despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "This is how far I'm willing to go to show you that you're worth fighting for. That we're worth fighting for." David reached for his jacket, which was hanging on a hook by the stairs. He held it out to her, not because he was uncomfortable with her vulnerability, but because he could see she was cold. The lamp room was drafty, and the storm had dropped the temperature. She looked at the jacket for a moment, then at his face. "Are you asking me to cover up because you can't handle this? I'm asking you to put this on because you're shivering, and I don't want you to get sick," David said quietly. Something shifted in her expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. She took the jacket and slipped it on, pulling it tight around herself. It was too big for her, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. But it was warm and it smelled like him. "You still take care of people," she said softly. "Old habits." They stood facing each other in the rotating light, the storm raging outside but somehow feeling less threatening now. David could see that Lisa was exhausted, emotionally drained from everything she'd just revealed. But there was also something peaceful about her expression, like she'd finally set down a weight she'd been carrying for too long. "What happens now?" she asked. David looked out at the storm, then back at her. "Now we wait for morning, and then we figure out what comes next." It wasn't the answer either of them had expected, but it felt right. Some things couldn't be rushed, couldn't be forced. Some things needed time to grow again, like plants after a long winter. "Can you do that?" David asked. "Can you wait without knowing what the answer will be?" Lisa pulled his jacket tighter around herself and nodded. "I've waited 3 years already. I can wait a little longer." The lighthouse beam swept over them one more time, and in that moment of light, David saw something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. The storm lasted until just before dawn. David and Lisa had spent the night in the lamp room, taking turns sleeping in the single chair while the other kept watch over the ship struggling through the rough waters. It wasn't comfortable, but somehow it felt right, like they were sharing something important, even if it was just the responsibility of making sure the lighthouse kept working. As the first pale light began to creep across the horizon, the wind finally started to calm down. The waves were still big, but they'd lost their angry edge. The ocean looked tired, like it had exhausted itself fighting against the shore all night. Lisa was asleep in the chair, wrapped in David's jacket and a blanket he'd brought up from downstairs. Her face looked peaceful, younger somehow. The stress lines that had appeared around her eyes over the past 3 years seemed to have smoothed out during the night. David stood at the window, watching the sun slowly paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. He'd seen hundreds of sunrises from this lighthouse, but this one felt different. Everything felt different, like the storm had washed away more than just the debris on the beach below. He heard Lisa stirring behind him and turned to see her stretching, wincing slightly from sleeping in the chair. Her hair was messy, sticking up in directions that would have mortified the woman he'd known 3 years ago. But she didn't seem to care anymore about looking perfect. "Morning," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months, actually." She stood up and joined him at the window, still wrapped in the blanket. "Wow, it's beautiful." The ocean stretched out before them, calm and blue-green under the morning light. The beach was littered with seaweed and driftwood that the storm had thrown up, but the chaos of the night before seemed like a distant memory. I should make coffee, David said. But he didn't move away from the window. In a minute, Lisa replied. I want to watch this first. They stood side by side as the sun climbed higher, painting everything in warm golden light. The lighthouse beam had automatically shut off with the dawn, leaving them in natural light for the first time since Lisa had arrived. David, Lisa said quietly, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I understand. I know I hurt you badly, and I know trust isn't something that can just come back because I want it to. David nodded, but didn't respond immediately. He'd been thinking about this all night, during the hours when he'd stood watch while she slept. Thinking about forgiveness, about second chances, about whether some things could be repaired or if they were broken forever. When you left, he said finally, I thought it was because I wasn't enough. Because I hadn't made you feel secure enough, loved enough, wanted enough. Lisa's face crumpled. David, no. It was never about you not being enough. I know that now. But for 3 years I carried that around. The idea that I'd failed somehow. That I'd missed some sign that you were unhappy. They walked down the spiral staircase together, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Back in the main room, everything looked different in the morning light. Less dramatic, more ordinary, but also somehow more real. David went to the kitchen and started making coffee while Lisa folded the blanket and straightened up the room. It was such a normal domestic scene that it made his chest tight with memory. They'd done this same dance hundreds of times in their old apartment, moving around each other with the ease of people who knew each other's rhythms. I kept some of your things, Lisa said suddenly, then stopped herself. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have mentioned that. David looked up from the coffee maker. What things? Just small stuff. A book you left at my place, a sweatshirt you forgot, some photos. She sat down on the couch, tucking her legs under her. I know I should have gotten rid of them, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I kept things too, David admitted. More than I should have. The coffee finished brewing, filling the room with its rich smell. David poured 2 cups and brought one to Lisa, sitting down in his chair across from her. The same positions they'd been in the night before, but everything felt different now. What's your life like now? David asked. I mean, day to day. What do you do? Lisa wrapped her hands around the warm cup. I'm a teacher now. 3rd grade. I went back to school while I was in Chicago, got my teaching certificate. That surprised him. Lisa had always been good with kids, but she'd never mentioned wanting to teach when they were together. Do you like it? I love it. The kids are honest in a way that adults rarely are. They tell you exactly what they think, and they don't care if you're having a bad hair day or if your clothes aren't expensive enough. She smiled. It's helped me learn to be more honest, too. David could see that. The woman sitting across from him was more direct than the one he'd known before, more willing to say difficult things out loud. What about you? She asked. Besides the lighthouse, what do you do with your time? I read a lot. Fish when the weather's good. I've been learning to cook, which is harder than it looks. You always said you wanted to learn guitar. David gestured to a corner of the room where an acoustic guitar sat on a stand. Got it about a year ago. I'm terrible at it, but it's something to do with my hands when my mind gets too busy. They talked for another hour as the sun climbed higher outside. Small talk mostly, safe topics that didn't require them to make any big decisions or declarations. But underneath the ordinary conversation, something was building. A sense of possibility that neither of them wanted to acknowledge yet, afraid it might disappear if they looked at it too directly. Finally, Lisa set down her empty coffee cup and stood up. I should probably head back to town. I need to find a place to stay, and you probably have things to do. David nodded, though part of him wanted to ask her to stay longer. The road should be clear now. The storm would have washed away any debris. Lisa gathered her things, folding David's sweatshirt and sweatpants neatly. She handed them back to him, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Thank you, she said, for letting me stay. For listening. For not throwing me out in the storm. I'm not that cruel. No, you're not. She looked around the room one more time, as if memorizing it. David, would it be okay if I came back? Not today, but maybe in a few days? I'd like to continue this conversation when we've both had some time to think. David considered this. Part of him wanted to say no, to protect himself from any more potential hurt. But a bigger part, a part that had been dormant for 3 years, wanted to see where this could lead. There's a sunset tonight that should be pretty spectacular, he said. After a storm like this, the sky usually puts on quite a show. Lisa's face lit up with understanding. What time? Around 7:30. I'll be here. She walked to the door, then turned back. David, thank you for seeing me. All of me. It means more than you know. After she left, David stood at the window watching her car disappear down the coastal road. The lighthouse felt emptier than it had in years, but not in a bad way. More like a house that had been closed up for a long time and was finally getting some fresh air. He spent the day cleaning, organizing, preparing. Not just the lighthouse, but himself. For the first time in 3 years, he had something to look forward to. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he was ready to find out. As evening approached, David climbed back to the lamp room and watched the road. Right at 7:30, he saw headlights coming up the coastal highway. His heart started beating faster, and he realized he was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was 17 years old. Some endings, it turned out, were really just beginnings in disguise.